Need a presenter? Your Event Audio has you covered. Closed-circuit audio equipment with turnkey operation at your trade show booth, live event, or private event. YourEventAudio.com is the place to go. DJ services, MC talent, and a whole lot more. Check out YourEventAudio.com today.
Well, guess what? We're in the middle of May now. Time's just zooming right on along, and Father Time is saying slow down a little bit, but we seem to not be able to do that here on the Exhibitor Now podcast. I'm Mike Morrison, National Sales Director for WS Display, if you're watching our video version as always. And back in the saddle now is Kim Gischler, the Chief Content Strategist for Exhibitor Group and the Associate Publisher of Exhibitor Magazine. Welcome back.
Thank
I know
you.
your son graduated last week. That's awesome.
Yes, he did. A proud parent and also a veteran. So he both 6 years in the military in the Army, and he graduated gaming information multimedia. So he's don't know what the heck he's going to do right now because I told him to take a break. So
That's good. He earned that.
You know, when you're in the military, you've been talked at and told what to do for 6 years. You kind of have to, take a breather. But it was a lot. But I'm very proud parent.
You said Army, right?
Army, yeah.
I was Air Force myself before I went to college, and I know that track very well. And if it wasn't for the military, Mike might not be sitting here right now. He'd probably be in jail somewhere. We won't go down that road, but congratulations to him and good luck in the future. As you're seeing, if you're seeing this podcast now on the date of 17th, I am actually in the Caribbean. I am not here in my office in Atlanta. I am on PTO. But this is a pre-recorded version. We're going to talk about things that we can talk about. And right now at the forefront are two big events that are coming up for Exhibitor Group. Of course, we all know about Legislative Action Day taking place on May the 30th in Washington, D.C. with all of our industry. By the way, that event is sold out for the first time ever. We have a waiting list for people who drug around and didn't sign up. I'm guilty of that sometimes. Thank God I was one of the top 10 that jumped in there first. But we have over 150 participants this year coming in, which we've never seen before. And Tommy Goodwin is pulling his hair out over at the ECA. But he doesn't have any hair. That's the joke in that statement. But he'll appreciate that. But they're getting ready to get things going for that. Coming up May 30th, once again, I'll be there with Emily Olson from the magazine, as well as David Dubois, who you heard from last week's show, who did a great job of pinch hitting for Kim and sitting in and talking about the points that we're going to talk about today and maybe some others. Also coming up as a big Exhibitor Group activity, CTSM based, is in July 15th through the 19th, and that is Exhibitor Education Week. This is a new phase of a new activity as they're trying to group that education in 1 week span and not spread it out all over the year, and make it very easy for people to come to Fontainebleau in Las Vegas to have this education week. And I'm sure you've got some things you can add to that.
Yeah, we listened to them, or the attendees, and having it spread out and having different content in different times was just crazy. So we decided to consolidate it all in 1 week. July is usually technically probably the lowest craziness for shows. So it was an easy way to bring them all together, and you can achieve a lot in those 4 days of classes. So Monica's working her little heart out, trying to get all that content together and all the speakers lined up. So it should be pretty good, and I'm looking forward to it. July in Vegas.
That's right. Always in Vegas. Always a great time there. And unfortunately, I'm still trying. I'm seeing if I can work that in my schedule. But you go to exhibitoronline.com / or /CTSM, and I'm sure you can see all the information there to sign up and get information about that. So check that out. Let's move on. The growth after Q1 in 2024 seems to be a huge discussion, especially across our industry with the major players. Some reports have come out recently that the new quarter ended with some larger players saying they saw high-end growth as much as 30%. Now that's a big number, and with that in mind, 70 to 80% of the polled Americans are saying that their number one and number two concerns going into the end of the year elections and just all these polls are economy and inflation. So that hits our industry. And to see this growth, and I know I'm beating a dead horse. We talked about it last week with David and got his insights on it, but it's just an interesting thought that we're having so much inflation in doing everything right now, but we're seeing so much growth in our industry with this face-to-face comeback. It's just an interesting thing to think about, Kim.
Well, gosh, you still have to do business, and they have to be smart about how they're doing it. So yes, there is costs associated with everything, but I'm a firm believer that face to face is still the way they can really solve for what they're looking for. So I mean, you can do a lot of digital. I think people are just tired of being, oh, look, we're doing podcasts here. But we're also probably 80% of our day is on a Zoom call or whatever call we're on. But it's all video. And I think you really just get so much more done on that face to face. And so they're going to spend the money to do it no matter what.
I'm in the middle of it myself. We are jumping off, the deep end here, and I'm being elevated to a VP position, and I'm hiring 3 people to go out to do the face to face all over our country that I can't do by myself, or rely on digital resources to do that. It's a nice compliment. It's good to have. You can't rely on it, in my opinion. So it's just interesting.
And you know what? There's something to be said to be in a room and get the feelings off of everyone and really get the passion and get excited about something. So I think companies are seeing that as well, and they get a lot more done with that face to face, and it's just not going to go away. They're going to spend the money to do it. Fall is a huge time with a lot of user conferences that are going on, especially in the Bay Area. So it's not. It just has to be done. Period.
So with all that said, our final bullet point is going to center on what everybody, I'm assuming in this industry and even outside, who's been to Vegas in the last 6 months or so is aware of, and that's the Sphere. Obviously, that big round ball that you can see from anywhere in Vegas that has digital content that changes all the time. And it's very impressive. It's a 17,000 seat venue. It's used for concerts and film presentations, but in just a few weeks, we will see our first conference industry customer take over that facility, and it's Hewlett Packard Enterprises who's taken it over with their president, who will be on stage and giving the keynote address. Let's cut to the chase here, because my mind goes in different directions when it comes to this stuff. Is it possible that we could start seeing industry keynote addresses, different aspects of a trade show or a conference, move outside of the conference area and go to points like this in major cities just to break up the monotony, even though it's going to cost a lot of money in some cases?
The Sphere is not cheap. Let's just put it that way.
No.
I think it's a brilliant move on HPE's part for the mere. Have you been to the Sphere inside?
Not yet.
So I was lucky to see opening night of U2. So I'm going to brag on that one. Okay. But it's brilliant for a keynote to go in there, because you have, no matter what seat you're in, you'll be visually looking everywhere. So you'll be constantly engaged no matter what is going on. So it's going to be interesting to see how attendees like it. I mean, I'm assuming it's going to be, the media, the wall behind it is so spectacular that you're going to be able to, you can be overstimmed, or you're going to be, it's going to be an amazing thing. I would say yes. I think people need to do something different. I think it's a bold thing for them to do, especially in this venue. It's going to be a test to Antonio's presenting ability to see how he does. But I think more and more people or companies should do something like that, because it kind of innovates. It shows them in a different light, and it constantly pushes the envelope. So I'd say you're probably going to see that more and more. A lot of people are doing it in different areas. It's just, Vegas is a unique area. I mean, you can do a lot of different things, but bravo to them. They should. It's, if you can afford it, it's great. But there's a lot of things you can do that's not going to be costing you that amount of money to present in a different light. So I think I encourage smaller companies to think out of the box and see where they can add that benefit, and rely on their vendors to help them, or their suppliers to help them to think of that way. Because, budget's a huge thing for those keynotes and to bring all those people in together and to talk to that audience. And if you don't have it, you don't have to have it, but it helps. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
It's obviously everybody's trying to inch forward ahead of their competition and do something bigger and better. So that's the first thing I come up with. The second thing I think of is Mandalay Bay has that tunnel that goes right underneath the interstate, goes right over to Allegiant Stadium. We've seen some events do that before. Here in Georgia, in Atlanta, the Georgia World Congress Center is connected pretty much on the same campus with Mercedes-Benz Stadium. I see those as easy ones. It's interesting to see if other cities start doing something similar to break up, once again, the monotony of the trade show hall ballroom, if you will, environment.
And I go back to what we discussed about, I don't know, 4 or 5 weeks ago, that this is where your CVB can really, really, really help you, because they know those unique venues. It could be a university, it could be a church, for God's sakes. I mean, it could be anything. So you get those backdrops, you can have an outdoors. I mean, it can, all these things can happen, but I rely on those unique, the city knows what they can solve for. So rely on them.
So interesting points before we get into this interview. Charles Pappas, we've been touting for some time. He's the senior writer for Exhibitor Magazine and does a great job, obviously, interviewing people for stories that come for the publication. Now he gets his shot here on the podcast where he will interview Charles Duhigg, who is a writer for The New Yorker. He is an author of several books, including The Power of Habit and others. So it'll be interesting discussion to hear some of the takes from Charles. It's the Charles and Charles podcast interview time.
Well, and his new, I think you're talking about the new book he has coming out. It's Super Communicators. So how to unlock the secret language of communication. So this should be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to it. But yes, we're going to have sign languages on Charles or Charles.
Yes, it's who's talking now. That
who's talking? But it'll be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be interesting. It's coming up next here on Exhibitor Now, right after this.
Attention, trade show and event marketing professionals. Are you ready to take your face-to-face marketing expertise to the next level? Join more than 3,000 candidates currently enrolled in Exhibitor Group's Certified Trade Show Marketer Program. CTSM is corporate America's top source of the industry's best trade show and corporate event training. CTSM certified trade show marketers enjoy expanded career opportunities, greater respect and authority in their organizations, and earn higher salaries than their acronym-free peers. Learn more, earn more. Visit ctsm.com today.
Welcome back to the Exhibitor Now podcast for May the 17th, 2024. As we said on the front end, communication, it's a very, very important topic in business in our world today, and it has so many aspects to it. And what better way to learn than from an expert? A couple of them, actually. You know Charles Pappas, who's the senior writer for Exhibitor Magazine, joins us here on the show, and he's going to introduce our guest at this time.
When it comes to communicating, to paraphrase Charles Dickens, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. We've got cell phones and social media. We have FaceTime and WhatsApp and Zoom. With a few clicks, we can communicate any moment of the day with anyone from Albuquerque to Zurich. So why then are we so bad at it? The novelist E.M. Forster said, only connect, but that's much easier said than done, because connecting or communicating isn't an inborn talent, as my guest today, Charles Duhigg, shares in his new book, Super Communicators: How to Unlock the Secret Language of Connection. It turns out that the ability to connect with other people is a skill like any other. We're not born great cooks, but we can become a pretty good one with enough practice and maybe enough viewings of Top Chef. If there's anyone eminently qualified to communicate about communicating, though, it is Charles Duhigg. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, New York Times best-selling author of The Power of Habit and Smarter, Faster, Better, frequent contributor to This American Life, NPR, The Colbert Report, PBS's NewsHour, and Frontline. He is also, to gild the lily a bit, a winner of the National Academies of Sciences, National Journalism, and George Polk Awards. Charles, welcome to Exhibitor Now.
Thanks for having me on.
It's our pleasure, believe me. I think many of life's epiphanies occur when we're rudely awakened to the fact that we're lacking something, or when we become immensely frustrated by our inability to accomplish something we badly desire. Did you have some kind of eureka moment when it came to communication?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I basically had these two things that happened, which is I was working at the New York Times and they made me into a manager. And I thought I would be great at being a manager. And it turns out I was terrible at it, right? I was terrible at communicating with the people who were reporting to me. And then I fell into this bad pattern when I got home, which is that, my wife and I have been married for 20 years, but I would come home and I'd start complaining about my day. And she would very reasonably give me this good advice, like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And instead of being able to hear what she was saying, I would get even more upset, right? I would say, well, why aren't you supporting me? You're supposed to be on my side. And then she would get upset that I was attacking her for giving me good advice. I think this is a pattern that many people probably experience in their own relationships. And so I started trying to figure out, what was I doing wrong? Why did this keep happening? Particularly since I'm theoretically a professional communicator. And so I started calling up experts and asking them, and they said, well, you're actually calling us at the right time because we're living through this golden age of understanding communication for the first time in a very real practical sense. And they said, one of the biggest mistakes we make is that we assume a discussion is about one thing. It's about our kids or our day or where we should go on vacation next week. But actually, every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations. And these different kinds of conversations, they tend to fall in one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're making plans together or solving problems. But then there's also emotional conversations where I might tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other. And what they said is, what we've discovered is that all these different kinds of conversations, they're all equally legitimate. But if you're not having the same kind of conversation at the same time as the person you're talking to, then you can't really hear each other and you can't really connect.
After you became interested in the topic itself, you took a deep, deep dive, and I'm talking Mariana's Trench deep here, into one of the most fascinating parts of communication, which, by the way, you learned from a spy of all things. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I love this is a great story. Thank you for asking. Jim Lawler is his name. And in the 1980s, he was hired by the CIA. He was 30 years old, really young. He had wanted to be in the CIA his entire life. And they send him through training, and then they send him to Europe and they say, go recruit some spies. And he is absolutely awful at it. He is so bad at recruiting spies. He would go to parties and he would try and sort of chat people up, and they'd say things like, I know you're trying to recruit me for the CIA. If you don't go away, I'm going to report you to the authorities. And so this is kind of a problem for him until he meets this woman. She's in town and she works for the foreign ministry of her government in the Middle East, but she's visiting Europe. And he starts chatting her up and taking her to lunch, and they get to know each other and they become friends. And eventually he says, I work for the CIA. Would you help me? And she says, absolutely not. They kill people for stuff like that in my country. And she starts crying and runs away. And Lawler goes and he tells his bosses what happened. And they said, look, we've already told Washington, D.C. that you recruited this woman. If you don't close the deal here, you're going to get fired. So Lawler convinces her to have one more dinner with him, and they go out to dinner, and she's in kind of a glum mood because she's about to go back to her country. She'd come to Europe trying to figure out how she was going to stand up for women's rights back home, how she was going to stand up against the religious radicals that had taken over the government recently. And she hasn't come to any real realizations, and so she's glum. And so Lawler tries to cheer her up. He tells little jokes, he tells stories, they reminisce about when they went sightseeing together, and none of it works. And towards the end of the meal, he thinks to himself, I give up. Like, I'm not going to be able to connect with this woman. There's no way I'm going to be able to convince her to take a suicidal risk on my behalf. And so he just gets really serious and honest. He says, look, I understand how you feel, because I feel disappointed in myself too. I've wanted this job for so long. And it turns out I'm terrible at it. And I think I'm going to get fired. And I understand how frustrating it is to not live up to your own hopes and dreams. But differently, he matched her, right? He started having the same kind of conversation she was having. And she listened and she started crying. And she said, I can help you. I want to do something important. I want to be part of this. And she became one of the best assets for the CIA in the Middle East for the next 20 years. But it's only because Jim Lawler learned to connect with her, to match her, to hear what kind of conversation she wanted to have, and to lean into that.
You know, while you're telling that story, it hit me. It's probably not quite what Ian Fleming had in mind with James Bond. But on the other hand, Lawler was probably better suited to the actual world of espionage than 007 ever was. What's intriguing to me is he wasn't naturally very adept at communicating with people, at least not in that stressful context. But he seems to be proof that it's a skill, again, that can be learned, a talent that can be duplicated. So what is it then that these super communicators, whether it's the CIA or whether it's Exhibitor Magazine or a trade show coordinator, what is it that super communicators have in common? Can you break it down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. When I started writing this book and reporting, I thought that super communicators would all be charming and outgoing and extroverts. And it turns out that's not true at all. That, as you point out, communication is just a set of skills, and they're skills that anyone can learn. And we're all super communicators at one point or another, right? We all know when a friend calls the right question to ask to help figure out what's going on. We've all walked into that meeting and we know exactly what to say to win everyone over to our side and our ideas. But there's some people who can do this consistently. There's some people who recognize the skills that they're using in those moments and can apply them to any situation. And you're right, there's some qualities that they have in common, or some tactics. The first is, we know that consistent super communicators, they ask 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And some of those questions are what are known as deep questions, questions that ask others about their values or their beliefs or their experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's as simple as if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of saying, "Where do you practice medicine?" saying, "Oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Do you love being a doctor?" When we ask that kind of a question, a deep question, what we're really doing is we're saying, "I want to connect with you and learn about you. Will you tell me the things that matter to you?" And those are easy questions to ask, but what we know from study after study is that they make us feel closer, they make us feel more trusting of each other, and they allow us to connect.
You know, one of the commandments of effective salespeople, whether it's business to business or business to consumer, is take the customer's perspective. That is, we should always try to see a situation from their point of view, their perspective, to show them we empathize. But what I was intrigued by, in some ways, you say that's a misguided approach. I mean, why? How could that possibly be wrong?
Yeah, there's been a lot of studies that have looked at, it's not that we shouldn't take the customer's perspective, it's that we're often wrong in what the customer's perspective actually is. And so instead of perspective taking, what we should engage in is perspective getting. And the way that we get that perspective is we ask some questions. We ask some questions that all boil down to, what does this mean to you? What's important to you? What's a problem that you're facing that I can help you solve? Rather than me assuming I know what your problems are, or assuming I know what kind of solutions you're looking for. If I simply ask questions, deep questions, then what I'm doing is I'm asking you to tell me what kind of a conversation you want to have, how you see the world. And at that point, it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. And I can just connect with you.
You know, the people listening to us today are mainly going to be trade show or corporate event professionals who have a kind of unique communications challenge. Their customers, let's say, enter a booth or they attend an event where they sometimes have as little as 30 seconds, or if they're really lucky, 5 whole minutes to connect. Each probably feels it's a transactional relationship, no matter what pleasantries are exchanged. And any attempt at communication is basically a camouflage sales pitch. So, how do we get around that? How do we use the techniques you've learned, you've studied, to truly communicate in that limited and sometimes frustrating context?
I speak at a lot of conferences, and you're exactly right. This is the number one question I get, which is people who say, "Look, I'm in this environment where everything feels transactional. How do I actually connect with someone?" And interestingly, the answer is by proving that we're listening. Again, a number of studies have looked at this, and what we know is that oftentimes when we are in a conversation, we have a suspicion in the back of our head that the other person isn't actually listening to us. They're just waiting their turn to speak. Right. And this happens with sales pitches all the time. I'm telling you my problem, and I think you don't care about my problem. You just want to tell me why I should give you my money. So how do we get around that? How do we prove that we're actually listening, that we actually want to understand? A lot of people sometimes mistakenly think it's how we behave when the person is speaking. We nod our heads, we make eye contact, but speaking is such a cognitively intense activity that you can't really notice what your audience is doing. What matters much more is what you do after someone stops speaking. And there's actually a technique that they teach at Harvard Business School and Stanford Business School, a bunch of places, called looping for understanding. What it says is, to prove that you're listening, there's 3 steps. The first step is ask a question, preferably one of those deep questions. Step 2 is, once the person has answered the question, repeat back in your own words what you heard them say, but don't mimic them, right? Don't just echo what they've said. Prove to them that you are paying attention. Prove to them that you're thinking about what they told you. And then step number 3, and this is the one we usually forget, ask if you got it right. Because what will happen is one of 2 things. Sometimes we ask that and they say, no, you didn't understand what I was saying, which is good, right? We've learned that we were off base. But more frequently what someone says is they say, yeah, no, I think you understand me. And what we're doing in that moment is we are asking them for permission to acknowledge that we've been listening. And one of the things that's interesting about how our brains have evolved when it comes to communication is that when we believe someone is listening to us, we become more willing to listen to them. So if I want to entice you to listen to me, to listen to my sales pitch, to get to know me, the best way I can do that is to prove to you that I'm listening to you, because that's going to trigger this hardwiring in our brain that makes you more amenable to listen in return.
Time's running out, Charles. So before we wind up for the day, I want to ask you a personal question.
Sure.
You write a book, but sometimes the book writes you, in that we become vastly more knowledgeable about a subject, more capable of mastering a given idea. We become, in effect, the avatars of the ideas we enclosed inside its pages. And that's usually a good thing. But has this book inflated your friends and your family's idea of your ability to communicate? That is, do they expect you now to connect with them, communicate with them perfectly and instantly?
It's a good question. What's interesting is that I have found, this is my 3rd book, and I found that one of the things that makes writing a book much better is to give speeches about it while I'm writing. Because when you're on a stage and you're talking to an audience, you really have to boil those ideas down to their essence, right? You have to find the elements of them that are most important and most impactful. And I will say that as I've given those speeches, and as I wrote this book and published it, and now I'm promoting it, you're right. There's been a number of people who have said, I expect this to be a great conversation. Luckily, my wife is not one of them. In fact, oftentimes we're at the dinner table and I'll start monologuing to my kids about something, and she'll say, there's this book you might want to read about communication. So if anything, it's given them a little bit of ammunition to say, like, maybe you should take some of your own medicine.
That's really delightful. And thank you for that both enlightening and informative answer.
Yeah, you know what? With the last comment you made about listening, talking to, I think you can really enhance this with when people ask you to do something, kind of taking a pause and say, I heard you asking me to do it this way, but instead of, we were talking about this earlier, instead of punting it to me or throwing it over the fence to see if it catches or sticks. I've learned in my career that you have to ask the why.
Yeah.
And I loved what you said earlier about, listening and kind of looping the conversation or understanding what they're saying. I think that why question isn't asked enough in the business world, because people are so used to being busy and doing things that they're just getting used to being told, but I want you to do it this way. What is your comment on that, on the why? I think, because I find it invaluable.
I think you're exactly right. And I think, ultimately what a deep question is trying to do is it's trying to ask you that why, right? Because the truth of the matter is, I can ask you about all the facts of your life or all the facts of this task you want me to help on. And those are usually dead ends. If I ask you, where'd you go to high school? Or I ask you, where do you live in town? We don't have that much to talk about. But if I ask you the why, what did you like about high school? Why do you live up in the Heights? What is it that you're trying to achieve with this task? Why are you handing this off to me? Like, what do you really want at the end?
Mm-hmm.
When I ask why, that's when I give you a chance to tell me what's important to you. And that's really, really important or that's really, really impactful, because once I know what's important to you, that's when I get a chance to see the world through your eyes a little bit. That's the chance that I get to understand you, and even equally importantly, to speak in a way that you can understand me. So I think asking that why is really, really valuable. And you're right. Sometimes we forget to do it, and sometimes it feels like it might be awkward. But the truth of the matter is, and study after study shows this, when we ask someone why, they are overjoyed to tell us.
Right. Thank you. You just confirmed to anyone out there that I've worked for or will work for again, that I am doing the right thing.
Exactly. You're perfect.
The other one is, I will say that I use this, and it's basically your 3 that you use, but I do it a different way. Is when someone calls me or asks me for questions or whatever, I just sit there and listen. And then they look at me and I go, do you want an advice? Do you want solution? Or do you just want my ears? Because
That's exactly. And in fact, they actually teach that in schools now. So in New York and New Jersey, they teach teachers that when a student comes up and they have something they want to talk about, the first thing the teacher should do is to ask, do you want to be helped? Do you want to be hugged? Or do you want to be heard? Which I think is the same 3 things that you
it's the
just said.
same. I think we all say it differently, but it's
Yeah.
so impactful, because then you are being present for the conversation, and
Yes.
then you can just relax. Or if you want my advice, then I have to think of something, but now the premise of what you're supposed to be doing and what you're there
That's
for.
exactly right. And you know what their goal is and what your goal is. And oftentimes, once we have the same goal, that's when we can connect with each other. That's when we become aligned.
George Bernard Shaw once said, the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Super communicators can help make sure that any communication you have is anything but a figment of your imagination. I want to thank our guest again, Charles Duhigg, for appearing today on Exhibitor Now. And if you'd like to reach out to Charles, he's represented by the Harry Walker Agency at harrywalker.com. That's www.harrywalker.com. That's it for today. We'll see you soon.
Are you searching for trade show and event products and services? Find It on Exhibitor Exchange is your complete buyer's guide to trade show exhibiting and events, featuring the trade show industry's top exhibit and display providers. Find It on Exhibitor Exchange is the industry's best shopping and commerce resource for buyers and sellers of exhibit and event products and services. Reaching 20,000 exhibit and event buyers in every print issue of Exhibitor magazine, and 140,000 exhibit and event buyers online each year. Search the listings or list your company today. Learn more at exhibitoronline.com/findit.
Well, I don't know about you, Mike, but I was incredibly inspired. The Charles and Charles show was great. We did well on navigating the Charles and Charles. But I had a couple things I wanted to I took away from this. And I think you probably had a couple too, or things that stood out. I love this one thing. I'm going to read this because it's important. Communication, as we know, is a superpower. You do live it every day. We all live it every day. But then how we are participating in the conversations. He said 3 conversations are the practical one, what this is really about, the emotional one, how do we feel about it, and social. Who are we? So if you don't know the kind of conversation you're having, you're unlikely to connect, which I think, you live in this world all the time. I do too. It goes back to be present and to really listen to who you're talking to and actually feel like they're the most important person in the room. I had a lady, an old boss of mine from HP, a matter of fact. She was head of I want to say all the partners. She knew whenever we went to a conference, she knew everyone's name, their kids. I mean, she listened so much, which is a gift. And I think that if we could all stop and put our devices down and really be present in some of these conversations, I think it will enhance our ability to be more kind in the future. What do you think?
It's very interesting about the listening and remembering part, because I can't even remember what I had for breakfast this morning. And
that was 20 years ago too. So maybe she's not as good now.
It's a gift.
Yeah.
that a lot of people have, and it's one that I wish I had more of. I try. It's funny, it almost echoes a little bit of your sentiment that you say a lot of times about conversations, right? Is do you want my feedback? Do you want my ears? Or do you want the other thing that you say?
Advice.
Huh?
Yeah.
Advice?
Yeah, it was a advice, a solution, or ears.
Ears, right? Because there's your three, and they kind of simulate the three that you mentioned. You got to know where you're at in the conversation if you're going to make something positive out of it. Another thing, another book he wrote that I mentioned to you earlier off mic was The Power of Habit. And in his LinkedIn header, he states a statement in there that's so true. The right conversation at the right moment can change everything, just like that. And I've seen it so many times in my 24 plus years in this industry, years before that in radio. Just the right timing of everything does come into play. And when you do have the right timing, then you go solidify what you just talked about and know where you're at in that conversation. And it's so strange that I have a communication arts, mass communication. I can't even say it. Mass communications of arts. It was a BS in science.
This is pre-vacation for you, so you're
It
okay.
is. Right now, as I said, I'm on the water. I'm drinking drinks with umbrella sticks in them, so I'm not really knowing where I'm at. And I'm just thinking ahead. But it's a great discussion with Charles and Charles. We appreciate them taking time out to talk here on the Exhibitor Now podcast. As we mentioned before, this is an every other week show now. So our next show will actually take place in Washington, D.C. On the Thursday before the launch of the show, right after that. So tune in and catch both the Association and Advocacy Focus podcast as Tommy Goodwin and I have our discussions there on the Hill, and then this one as well for the Exhibitor Now podcast.